Hello, everyone. Krydax here, and welcome to the Factory Must Grow, episode 50. Today, we are joined by a special guest, Jack of Boxes, a developer on an idle desktop factory game. Jack, how you doing today?
Doing pretty good. How are you guys?
We're doing well. We're glad to have you. Also joining us, as
Great.
usual, is Galdoc. Galdoc, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you? Wait, hold on. We just did that.
I am still good. Still good. Things are nice. So today's a little bit of an special episode because we're not going to be talking about Factorio in as much as it's not the main topic. Of course, it'll come up because anything regarding factory gaming usually involves Factorio in some form or fashion, as it is the grandfather. But that being said, we don't have a mod spotlight today, so I'll just start with my normal Patreon announcement and then we'll dive in. So, as usual, I do want to thank the show's patrons. This show is possible and supported by you, the listeners. If you'd like to support the cast, head over to patreon.com/Krydax or patreon.com/Galdoc. And that's about all I have to say about that. So today we are diving into game development because Jack is working on an idler desktop factory game, and he'll be able to talk about some of the variety of things that go into developing a factory automation game, some of the design kind of philosophies that he's using, and of course Galdoc has a lot to add into that. And so I'm just excited to hear from these two, and we'll start with kind of an intro. Jack, who are you? What do you do?
I am Jack, and I am a game developer. I do a little bit of everything. I would say that on the last project I worked on was called Sirocco, and I did a lot of the game design, a lot of the music direction, and a lot of the art direction. But like I would say generally my approach is like game design is king, in myself, my brother, and one of my best friends, Eric. We're the kind of the group that's always worked together, and we've always kind of taken design as like a group, and that's really important for kind of the core of where all games should start.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when did you get into like game design and development, and kind of when and how did that start?
Yeah, it's actually the first time I really started taking it more seriously was with Warcraft 3. Me and my best friend I just mentioned, we're like Warcraft editor users. Like we would make our own custom mods and stuff like that. Um,
Yes. Oh, you're speaking my language. I grew up on Warcraft
yeah,
3 custom maps.
yeah, and it was just incredible.
Tower defenses or more of the like Footman Wars, or what direction we talking here?
We were really into hero survivals games, so like all the kind of wave. I don't know if you played like War Gladiators, but we had like a one game called Doom Knights that had all these really cool like hero designs and a lot of survivals. But tower defenses were amazing. I mean, like all the different malls and
Mm-hmm.
even like Liquid TD was like a really old school one that we loved.
Yep. Liquid TD was like my OG. I
Television.
think that was the first tower defense
Yeah.
I ever played.
Yeah, Liquid TV was like one of the earliest, like, really popular ones, and I go back and still like it. Like it's a little bit limited, but
The
it's really fun.
nostalgia waves are
I'm,
hitting me so hard right now.
I just wanted to point out that you said Liquid Television, and I didn't think of the Warcraft 3 mod. I thought of the MTV thing, Liquid Television,
We're saying
with
Liquid
Aeon.
TD, tower defense.
TD.
Oh, okay. I'll go back with my Aeon Flux fanboyness over here.
Oh man. Okay, so I'm sorry. I had to nerd with you a little bit there. So back to what you were saying about that being the birth of your game dev.
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, we just made a lot of games, but thought it'd be fun. And Eric is super brilliant with game design and actually like working in the editor. And we kind of ended up in different places in our life. But fast forward to like 2020, that was when games were really taking off in the kind of zeitgeist of people. And I remember like it was me and my brother, we were together for Christmas, and we're like, man, if we ever get rich, we got to make that one mod, Battleships, into a standalone game, which was kind of like a proto MOBA. It was
Mm-hmm.
before Dota 2 existed. It was kind of right around Dota 1 that it was made, and there was all these different kind of versions of it, and we ended up making like our own kind of version. It wasn't as popular as like Battleships Pro, which was the big
I
one.
loved Battleships. It was so
It's
fun.
it's so fun.
Because it was
And we're like,
kind of like it was a little bit like a Vampire Survivor situation. Because you would put weapons on your ship, and they would like auto fire out of your ship, and so it kind of was
exactly.
that vibe too.
Yeah, that was what we really loved about it. We're like, you don't have to right click in the same way. There's not auto firing. It's much more of a distributed economy too, because they, don't have last hits in the same way. And we're like, man, I think that's a really rich place to look at making a standalone game. And we're like, man, we should do that at some point. Like, you know what? What if we just look at making it now? Like, what would it look like to actually develop it now? We had no idea what we're doing, but lo and behold, like a year later, we ended up having a demo and we showed it to some, random investors we met at a conference. And he's like, oh my God, I love battleships. And we ended up getting investors to make our game. And 4 years later, we came out with Sirocco, which is, the title that you can play now on Steam.
That's so cool. I
Yeah.
need to go check that out because battleships, it truly, if I was to make a list of like my favorite, top 5 Warcraft 3 kind of custom games I played over the years, I mean, Dota was probably the number one for me. Dota All Stars, I guess, was the main one,
Yeah.
but
It's amazing.
and then battleships was definitely up there. I think probably the other one would be Jim. No, what's it called? The tower defense with the element TD, which turned into its own game eventually. Um, but yeah, so cool. So how did you
Hold
approach
on.
game? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to do a quick shout out to Ziadama. He's the current Battleships Crossfire designer.
Oh,
And
awesome.
AC too. He's from the Battle Tanks community, so they're here checking it out.
Awesome. And we've got them in the Twitch chat right now. That's so cool. So as far as game design, so that being kind of the first game you officially designed, how did you approach the development to that? And what did you feel like you and your brother and anyone else that you wrapped into the project, what were some of your kind of underlying philosophies for how you designed the game? How did you decide to make it a good game? Everybody can make games, but how do you make it a good game?
Yeah. So I mean, well, listen, game design is such a deep topic, but actually one of the most interesting first steps I took into kind of taking that question more seriously was actually in university. I was studying aesthetics, which is like, kind of a highfalutin and douchey sounding thing to say you study, but it's actually it's really answering the same question, right? Which is like,
Yeah,
how do people appreciate things? And the funny thing is, like, I would study a lot about games essentially, because it seemed like a lot of the research I was reading would kind of mention games, but they didn't really talk about them in any meaningful way. Like, it felt very different from what it was like as a Warcraft 3, map maker, and it did not seem very connected to like what most gamers would talk about, like what makes a good game. Um, and that's actually like when I first started looking at idle games. Even Paperclips was one of the games I did like research on, and I talked to the creator Frank Lantz about it. And that was like one of the first times I was like, wow, okay, there's a lot here that hasn't been really discussed or talked about in a more deep, structured way. And I think that's even what led us to look at battleships as like, oh, what are the game elements here that are super unique? What is it doing differently from Dota? What is it doing differently from any game that's been made before, right? There are so many MOBAs that came out, but to us, they were always kind of clones of other MOBAs that existed
sure.
instead of doing something that was unique and different. Um, but it wasn't really until we actually started development on Sirocco that we really realized that there's a huge importance and a huge need to having a kind of working theory of game design. Um, and that's really came out of the fact that, when we were working Warcraft 3, when you're working on a mod, you realize something isn't fun and you can just change it. And the feedback is like pretty direct. You put a custom game out there and it's either more successful or less successful. So it's kind of like a survival of the funnest. You have a really easy system to do kind of A/B tests on, and then you have a huge community that will play test. That is insanely valuable. Like, we had no idea how valuable that was when we get into
Yeah.
traditional game dev, because like suddenly you want to make a little change or maybe even a big change. You're like, oh man, these weapons don't feel good, and it's like 5 months of development, and that's like way too much money to not know what you're going to get from that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you realize quickly when you're in traditional game development that you have to have really strong visions for each one of your game system. And so, I think with Sirocco, we had to learn that over time. You know, we were both learning how to build a game for the first time, and then also learning how to design a game in a structured manner. But yeah, I'm really happy with what we end up in because, you know, ultimately you know, at least what we believe is that you can kind of create a model that predicts, you know, maybe not perfectly how a game system will feel to players, but gets you close enough to then understand, like, okay, this is what we need for our game. Um,
That's really
you know,
cool.
yeah, like a good example of that, I would say, just because it can sound very abstract when I'm talking about this stuff, is like, you know, in Soraka, for instance, at one point, people would give us a lot of feedback that, oh, I want to be more around the map. You know, I feel too stuck in the lanes, right? So I think like your initial impulse, if you just hear that feedback as a game designer, is like, oh, well, I just need to put more stuff around the map. But then if you do that, if you just put more stuff around the map, you quickly learn that people don't really care about it. You know, maybe they do it if they feel like it's a chore. You know, I don't know, getting some random you know, event that's happening. But until you kind of understand like what's the core motivation for players playing your game, what they're really looking for is a secondary objective that makes them more powerful, right? At least for Soraka. You know, every game is going to be different this way, but because people really are playing MOBAs for that experience of progression, of acquiring more power and then defeating their opponents, you have to make sure that that secondary objective is both something that they want to become more powerful and then is also kind of engaging to fight over with other players. Um, so kind of learning and developing a process to both analyze, like, you know, at least for MOBAs, they're so complex, right? Like there's so many different emergent layers that exist when you make one decision or one system change that you have to have an idea of like, well, what is that actually implicating? You know, what is that going to affect? And yeah, I think we actually ended up in a really good place where, you know, towards the end of our development, we were capable of coming up with really good ways of making our game better, which is much more difficult than we thought it would be.
Yeah, I'm very excited to hear about a lot of those things because yeah, with game dev, there's such a black hole of, like you said, you know, you can make one change, but testing it and seeing, does it actually meet the needs that my players have? Because players don't know what they need. They know what they don't like, first of all,
Mhm.
and then sometimes they know what they like, but almost never do they know what they need. You know what I mean? And so like you have to almost not listen to what they're saying, but what they're meaning, and that's really
Yep.
difficult. On top of, if you even have play testers, like you said, like before you make a change, you haven't tested the change. So like, will this even be a fun
Yep.
change and all of that? So
Exactly.
once you had your so, what is it, Soraka?
Sirocco.
Rocco.
Sirocco. And so that came out, and then how did you get from that to now where you are in desktop factory idler development? What was that path?
I gotta say, this is actually the first time we're talking about this publicly too. So if
Ooh.
folks in my community are hearing this, this is gonna be exciting. But um, we essentially well, first off, I should say we're always been huge fans of Factorio, right? Um, you know, one of the greatest games ever made.
Very
And
much so. Agreed
Indeed.
completely.
yeah, so that's always been kind of, you know, a joy for us to play and something that's influenced a lot of like our thinking on game design. We would never normally think of creating anything in that genre just because it's so great, and particularly coming from making a MOBA where, you know, you run up against competing against another like fantastic game, which is Dota and League. Uh, I would say if you asked me, you know, a year and a half ago, this is not the direction I thought we would be going in. But there's been a huge movement in idle games for what's called a desktop companion. And I've been playing a bunch of them, like Rusty Retirement or Desktop Defender, where essentially you have these games that you play on the side of your screen or while you're doing other things. And the, you know, response from the community is really positive. Like people really love these types of games, and they're really looking for more games like it. And I came across this one Steam comment. It was a Steam review for Desktop Defender, and he goes like, "Oh, I should find it, and I could post it here. You could show to the Twitch stream." But he's like, "Man, I love all these games. I buy every single one of them. I'm just waiting for Factorio styled desktop companion game. And
There it is.
but until then, I'm just gonna play everyone that I find. And I was like, holy crap, that's such a genius idea, because as much as Factorio is, you know, so amazing to play, and you have situations where it is kind of passive, you're kind of waiting for your resources, you're always a little bit freaked out. You're always worried, at least for me. I'm always like, when are the biters going to attack? When am I going to run out of iron? Like when is the next moment where my entire supply chain is going to fall apart?
Mhm.
When is the other shoe going to drop?
Exactly.
It's working too smoothly. Something's got to go wrong.
There's something
Spoilage.
going wrong. Yeah.
All the biter eggs
Oh,
spoil.
Exactly. So it was a situation where it's like, well, we could easily make something where, it's more chill. It's more a game that you don't have a pressure to play, but at the same time, you can get that same feeling of, overcoming bottlenecks and, optimizing interesting functions in interesting ways. So that was kind of the first explorations. And then the more we looked at the desktop companion side, the more we realized it's a really a cool emergent feature, the fact that you have limited space. So suddenly you're not just building a factory in the same way you would in Factorio, you're actually having to build a factory in, a third of your screen.
Right.
And even more interesting from that, we decided to, conceptually go with the idea that you're drilling. So you're actually drilling a giant shaft into asteroids and planets. And then from that concept came this concept of like, there's a giant drill and it's actually digging more space. So you can, spend resources on powering the drill to get more space, or you can build more automation to get, resources to build more structures. And that dynamic, I think, is super rich. And then figuring out how the right ways to fit in optimal manners your supply lanes. But then also having it be kind of casual where, you can take your time and just accumulate resources really slowly. And that was kind of the basis of like, wow, there's a lot of rich territory here, and we can make something kind of special, I think.
Yeah. Did
there's
you
an-
ever play Motherload back in the day, the Flash game?
No, I never actually played
Oh
Motherload.
man.
I gotta
Okay,
look that
you
up.
gotta put that one on your list. This is an ancient Flash game for anyone that, is in their lower 30s or maybe upper
I think I've
20s.
seen this.
Yeah, it was a classic Flash game where you were a little bot and you would dig down and get resources and then go back up and sell them. And it was just like, I mean, I don't even know how to describe it, but it was magical for my tastes, back in the day. And it was like a game where I'm like, I want more of this. And it never really, there was never another game quite like it. I think there was one game that tried to copy it a little bit, but what you're describing of like digging in and getting resources, it's at least in the ballpark of that idea, dig dug type idea where you dig tiles.
Very
I
much
got to
remember
check it
Dig
out.
Dug. And
But
it's
all
funny to
that,
me because there's like this strain of thought that is, man, I really love this game, but what if also Factorio?
Yeah, true. That's happening a lot.
It is, but you know
Vampire
what?
Survivors.
Low key, no, high key. I love that.
High
Like,
key.
all the keys.
yeah, but like in this particular instance, I think there's, as someone who has not played any of these idler games, I'm going to be very interested to see how it feels, because my goal is to I actually want this on my desktop doing something while I'm trying to do other stuff, just to sort of see what this is like, because it sounds interesting to me. Still have
One
yet.
of
I need to try Rusty's Retirement at some point.
Yeah, you should check it out. I think there's so much room to develop the concept further. I think that was another big piece. Is like playing Rusty Retirement, playing a lot of them. I just keep feeling like, man, feeling that there's so much more you could do, right? There's so much more
Mhm.
you could explore.
Mhm.
And then we also always thought it'd be a funny meme to have Desktop Factory over Factorio. So you have someone playing Factorio, and then you have Desktop Factory on top of it. Like that has to
Factory.
go in the trailer, Like
Yep. Factory while you factory.
exactly.
Exactly.
Then
There's
even have like a
something
mod tie-in where, like in Factorio, if you do this thing in Desktop Factory, you get like whatever items.
Ti tying together games,
That was
it's so
horrible.
difficult to do and make work in any context, but whenever it happens, I just think it's so cool. I've never even played the versions of them. I just think it's cool that it exists. When like, people would like have I'm pretty sure someone's made it with a satisfactory to Factorio connection, and it's usually done with like online servers where like the server knows that it's made this much and then that communicates with the other server for the other game and then it spawns those resources or whatever. But really cool stuff. They got
Code
to, I
Green is a
mean,
good person to talk about that.
there was one thing where they did Factorio servers talking to other Factorio servers for a mega Factorio server, and they did 1,000,000 signs per minute before Space Age, like back in the old vanilla
Wow.
Factorio, by having like 30 or 40 servers linked together. Anyway,
That's great.
Code Green is a person who did a thing with like Twitch integration for Factorio, so that people could play Factorio, and then the people watching could just absolutely screw with the
yeah,
with
like
the
the
player.
crowd
And
control type stuff.
evidently, it was glorious to behold. I
I'm
never
sure
actually
it
did, but
was.
it's legendary. So,
So let's start with some of your design philosophies that you've kind of been talking about. And what are some of those ways that you talked about to make sure that when you're thinking about a change, how do you actually have any ability to predict, is this change going to move the needle towards the player experience and the game that we want, or is this not quite going to have the effect that we need? How do you have any idea where that's going to go?
Yeah, I think it kind of starts with the question of it's going to sound overly broad, but what is a game, right? There's a interesting thing you mentioned at the beginning, like, well, the purpose is to make good games, right? I think the question that people don't ask is like, well, what is that? What do we actually mean when we're talking about that question? I mean, that's a question that we asked ourselves. We're like, we're playing all these Warcraft 3 mods. Obviously, we know when our game is better or worse, but it's more of an intuition, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so, how do you start to analyze, like, well, what's actually the core of what a game is? And then how do you take that to then make claims and predictions of what would make it better? And I think you can do that intuitively, right? Like, I think anyone, and this is the most amazing part about gamers, people who love games generally tend to have very good intuition of why something is good or why something's bad. It's different from other mediums, like I did a lot of screenplay writing and stuff like that. And, there's a lot of people nowadays that just don't really have much care for what makes something good or not in other medias. I guess like mobile games would be the video game example. Do people
Sure.
really care about quality? Some people do. Um,
oh man,
but
that's my
with Steam games and people who take it seriously, they really do appreciate when you're thoughtful and working in, I think, a structured manner of like, you know, making a game better in the ways that we think gameplay evolves, right? And it really starts with us with like for me, I try to think of how do you come up with a overarching way of describing what we mean by a game? And that kind of brought me to like chess and Pong. You can use a lot of different games, but we call Pong a game and we call chess a game. What do they share, right? Like, what is the commonality between the two? And the kind of core of it, what we figured out, and I think most gamers intuitively would agree, is this idea of decisions. Now, the interesting thing about both games is that, chess, the decisions are really important, right? What pieces you move is pretty much the entire game. And Pong, the decisions are super simple, right? You're trying to hit the ball. It's not really that different. But both of them are kind of becoming, engaging and interesting to you as a player in different ways, right? Chess is the kind of emergent, all the different choices you could be making, versus Pong is more about can you actually do the thing you're choosing to accomplish, right? Like, can you actually hit the ball when it's going super fast? And if you take any game and look at it with that lens, it starts to kind of uncover what things are going really well and maybe what things could be improved upon, right? If I look at Elden Ring, there's a lot of it is coming from that execution of your choice, right? Can I actually dodge the boss that's trying to hit me? But then there's a lot of choices as well. What kind of build am I doing? What's my strategy to eventually execute on? Or not. Maybe sometimes it's just Mario, where it's more of that kind of execution style gameplay. Um, but then to go full circle with when it comes to making predictions of what a gameplay system will feel like, I think you then have to look at, all right, well, where is my game engaging in the first place, right? What kind of choices are players making that they're um, interested in, and then looking at how do we create more um, complex interactions, right? Or synergistic interactions is usually the way I like to think about it. Because ultimately, at least when you talked about Factorio, when you talk about, MOBAs, these games are very emergent, They have a lot of these systems that are layered on top of each other and produce, I would say, emergent synergies, right? And those synergies is what you are crafting builds around. That's what you're thinking about when you're not playing the game. What if I, get this item with this hero in this circumstance, then suddenly
Mm-hmm.
I can dominate, my opponent at this minute in the game. That's a classic thing in Dota or, Factorio is a little bit different where it's like, well, what if I, have this layout with this type of production line, and I make a sushi highway, then your life is hell, but it's really cool. But that comes from the layers of different systems that are creating interesting choices for you as a player, and then kind of, I think, engaging almost your creativity in a way, your desire to come up with unique solutions. So I mean that's one way to think about it. And is it the end all be all way of thinking about games? It's not really about that. It's that it for us is a good way of making productive choices, and ultimately we think we've gotten to a better place. Obviously with Sirocco, we always think we could have gotten better. I would always love to improve on the game. I think there's a lot of things we could improve upon. But at the same time, I'm really proud of like the changes that we did make throughout development, and yeah, I think that type of thinking really helped it.
Yeah, for me, it's whenever I'm thinking about this sort of topic, it's like there's a video that sort of captures it very well. It's a someone driving a car, and he like kicks the car up on two tires so that only two are contact with the road. And while he's driving, reaches out and changes the other tire, and then the car like lands again, and he continues driving away. And I'm like, oh yeah, so that's what making patches to your game is while it's in publication is, so or in
Yep.
production. So when I think of having to make changes in something as intricately connected as a Dota, I mean, that sounds very hard. I mean, you
Yeah.
change one little thing, and it's like this spider web of things that are connected to it that now are going to be changed when you tugged on this one thing. It tugs on these other pieces, and that part to me sounds very, very challenging. And
It
I
is.
think it's good to have an ethos approaching that.
Yeah, and I think
And
the interesting thing is the beginning of our development, for instance, when we didn't have as, I think, clear of a model to kind of look at what Battleships is doing really well, um, we kind of, I think, made too many assumptions of, oh, if we just simplify things, it's going to be better, right? Like, we're just going to distill the item, the weapons into, two different swappable things. I actually think we lost a lot of interesting emergent synergies in the process of that. So like there's weapons, for instance, I think is actually something in Sirocco I was never fully satisfied with, because I think it was before we had a clearer understanding of like, well, this is the type of choices we need to be optimizing for, because that's actually a really important emergent layer. So I think even though we were able to eventually make more and more of those things, to your point, it's so easy to make a change in one of these complex emergent games that has so many follow-on unintended circumstances or consequences, where you're just suddenly, you know, your game is shifting in ways you have no idea, unless you have a really strong way of analyzing it. Um, so yeah, that's a really great way of
Yeah,
putting it.
these are such interesting concepts. I think about these things a lot because I'm a fan of Magic the Gathering, and
Yeah.
I'm a fan of Path of Exile 2. And both of these are actually incredibly similar in this vibe that we're talking about, because build in Path of Exile 2 is a lot like a deck in Magic the Gathering. You are looking for those synergies
Absolutely.
between different unique items or different skills in Path of Exile versus in Magic the Gathering. You're like, oh, these two cards, they give me redundancy in this way, or I can make sure I have card draw, or I can deal with, if my opponent has enchantments, what do I do? And and then there's another game called Legends of Runeterra that one of my friends is a huge fan of. I really like the single player version, Path of Champions, unrelated thing. But the game only has 6 slots for units, or, permanents, or whatever you want to call them. Whereas Magic the Gathering, you can have as many as you want. And there's also, in the game, there's no lands or whatever. You just get your 1 mana gem per turn, which is how a lot of games deal with mana compared to Magic the Gathering, where you have lands. And There's a lot of interesting conversations I've had around that where, people will mostly argue that the land system in Magic the Gathering is bad and it's outdated, and the simpler, because what you just said, Jack, made me think about this, where you're like, generally you assume simpler is better. But sometimes simpler can remove, like going too simpler from a more complex system, you can remove these emergent interactions that sometimes are sort of the heart and soul of a game. Because with Legends of Runeterra, as cool as I think it is, I don't get excited thinking about decks in the same way because I know I can never get more than 6 units on the battlefield. Whereas in Magic, you get token doublers and crap, and you can have 100. And there's this emergence to that where the rules are not limiting your synergies because they're more complex. The stack in Magic the Gathering is incredibly complicated, but it allows for a lot of cool stuff that you can dream about. Whereas other games that don't have reaction spells and such don't allow for those. And so you end up in this situation where complexity is not an enemy, but it's rather, a potential obstacle that, like, you want your game almost to be as complex as possible without overwhelming the player is almost the goal, rather than as simple as possible.
1000%. Yeah, you said it brilliantly. I think Magic is one of the greatest design games. I'm still obsessed with it. And you hit the nail on the head where there is always diminishing returns with adding more complexity, in the sense that you can eventually add too many systems that are not actually adding that many emergent layers,
Right.
making things more interesting in a way. But if you're not 100% aware of where each system and what each system is contributing to the overall game experience, you're going to be cutting out emergent synergy without even knowing it. And I think your point with lands is a great one, right? I think you can always make changes to systems, and there are, I think, some amount of cursed issues. We call them cursed problems in game design, where it's like there's a core friction, that you can't actually overcome with any easy solution. You can have band-aids or whatever, but lands are a little bit like that in Magic the Gathering, where there will be games where you're mana screwed or mana flooded, and you're just going to lose because of that. But that's not necessarily a bad thing if the emergent property, if the depth that you're gaining from that system is greater than the cost. And I think Magic's the greatest example of that, where the fact that you have lands. I mean, I just played the Avatar: The Last Airbender one, and there's all this earth bending where you have tons of lands fighting the opponents, and there's so much intricate creative build strategy once you have that, because I think, to your point, you really become limited if you don't
And I think
have
that,
those systems.
yeah, and I think that it's not always, sometimes it's obvious when you've introduced some kind of a problem, like back in alpha and in limited, where you could get the one hand, the opening hand win, where it's like Black Lotus, a land, Fireball, and Life Channel or something. I can't remember the green one, where it's
Channel
basically, if you
Fireball.
get this hand,
Just
turn
channel,
one, you just win.
Yeah.
And you're done, and it's like game over. But and so those kind of are obvious and are sort of revealed through playtesting. But like, on the other hand, you have the other emergent properties where the changes can be more subtle, and really you just have to let a lot of people play and give you feedback in order to see some of those things. But like, I've always been a little bit suspicious of oversimplifying things. Like, simplifying things is, when I say simplifying things, I mean where you take out a mechanic, like in World of Warcraft, when it was first released. And I say World of Warcraft, I mean the actual the MMO. There were things that were in the game that eventually got removed, and I'm thinking of things like armor penetration, where there was a stat where you had to sit there and you had to game out what that stat would do. And they said, you know what, let's take it out. And then half the community is like, oh no, the game is too simple, you've ruined it. And the other half is like, I don't care, I'm playing a game, number go up. Me. I want to go raid bosses. That's basically what I'm here for. And so there is these, whether or not you add or subtract complexity really comes down to, do you understand how your systems interact? Because
Exactly.
that interaction is going to really tell you what is the cognitive load for what your players can and cannot understand when you've gone too far. How can they actually do calculations? Can they number the fun out of the game? You know, where you have
Mm-hmm.
you have a character that you're playing, and really, if you want to be competitive, there's one build with this gear, and your goal is to go get that gear and put these, points here. Is that possible, or is it more of a landscape where you can still make choices and have agency in these things? And I think
100%.
these sorts of decisions really, in a sense, make or break a game. Because I kind of think of it as like an organism living. You mentioned survival of the funnest. It's an organism living in an environment. And what we are doing as game designers is we're kind of playing God with the DNA of the game, and we're going to see how it survives in the environment. Is it going to flourish and be something that players come back to and enjoy? The decisions we've made, is that going to give rise to a game that does that, or is it going to wither, or is it only going to contract and be really, really appreciated by a small group of people who are super hardcore, or is it going to be very general? And almost all the time, it's something in between. And there's a lot of
Yep.
wisdom in figuring out exactly, what choices we make as designers is going to lead to what outcomes, and not just the player experience, but the overall game's performance.
That's exactly right. Like, I
My
think that
oh,
perfect. Go
so
ahead.
good.
Yeah, I mean, the key is that you need to be able to know your game, analyze it in order to ride that line of optimal amount of emergent depth with the kind of most simplest way of getting players interested in the game, right? I think that's the key. And I think the best games have done that, right? World of Warcraft is a perfect example of a game I think that really was capable of doing. People at the time said World of Warcraft was too simple, right? It was too
Little did they
casual.
know.
Yeah, too casual when it first came out compared to what it was, the other MMOs at the time. So it's, I think, Golden Age Blizzard was really capable of understanding the Goldilocks zone.
Rip.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. Rip the feast. Yeah, Diablo 2 is another great example of that, I think. But
Yeah. So
it's a
okay,
tough
this is
problem.
such good stuff. I feel like we could just talk on this topic for the next 3 hours. But I do want to get a little bit into factory stuff. So because I'm sure
Sure.
we'll talk more about game design as we go into this. But specifically, when you started out on the idea of a factory desktop idler, not only is there's three words there and they all mean something, right? The desktop idler part is kind of a combo, two words, but like obviously when you think of a factory game you think of Factorio, but you don't want to, like you said, just copy Factorio because that's really hard to compete with. And how would you make a game that's just better than that? But desktop idler alone is enough of a differential. But then on top of that, you're like, but you don't want biters and you don't want to time pressure. And how do you make a game that's in a limited portion of the screen? What factory elements do we want? What factory elements do we not want? So there's a lot to kind of discuss there. And I don't have a particular direction. So whatever direction you want to start with, Jack. What do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different approaches that could be taken to making, Factorio into a more casual experience. I don't think that it's necessarily why we're interested in doing a desktop factory idler, desktop companion idler. I think for us, the opportunity is what's gained when, looking at the different experiences of Factorio versus an idler, where in Factorio I feel always the need to be fully engaged, right? I need to be paying attention and looking to uh, grow my factory in a way that's more optimized and uh, more capable of taking on the requirements of progression, right? Versus a idle game, which is the opposite, right? I can play at any pace that I want. I could take it more seriously and try to progress much quicker, or I could just let it sit for days on end and acquire resources and eventually get there. Um, so I think for us, it's so much about, well, what if we marry the components of Factorio where you are having those really rich experiences of like overcoming a bottleneck of, having gratification of like a perfectly optimized factory. Um, but then finding that experience that's more at your own pace without the kind of pressure, the time pressure that exists. That's where I think, we can have a lot of elements that are in Factorio, like belts and rails and all these kind of situations where, our game does have mechanics that are similar to it. Um, but at the same time, there's not that same uh, pressure. There's not that same anxiety that's producing there because I think, we'll always want people to play Factorio, but while they're working or while they're watching a video essay or while they're playing Factorio, they can have an automation game on the side, and that's fun. That they can do that at their own pace, right? That's where I think it's a different experience that you're looking for when you're trying to play one of these desktop companions. And I think marrying those two things is something that hasn't been done before.
Yeah. Okay. So, question about one of the things you were talking about with logistics. I think at some point, there's 49 episodes before this one. I'm pretty sure in one of them, I posed the question: Is Factorio an idler? Is it an incremental clicker idler game? And I don't totally remember everything I said, so it's possible I'm misquoting even myself. But at least in the current moment, what I seem to remember, one of the biggest differentials that I made between the two categories is actually logistics. Because in most incremental games, you kind of just have a pool of resources, like this infinite warehouse that collects everything that you produce and can provide to everything that needs those things, whether it's multiple resources or there's just money, like in Adventure Capitalist, or some games it's like thing A produces thing B, and then you produce building B that produces thing C, and it's kind of like a chain of resources. There's lots of varieties in different clicker slash idler games, but that's the gist. But most of them have no logistics. There is no part of the game that involves you transporting, even conceptually transporting, resources from a location to another location where you are designing part of that process. And most of even if an item moves in the sense that it's turned into a different item, that's through a building. So that's not really logistics. That's just another production chain. But Factorio, obviously, that's completely different. You can have all the iron you need, but it's not in the right place. And a lot of the game in Factorio is moving stuff. And if you remove that from Factorio, like you imagine every building is now connected to an infinite warehouse automatically, like shared inventory is a thing in mods. What if every building had the same shared inventory? Factorio would be a lot more like an idler, like that Flash game. What was it? Reactor Idle, where you place that. Like that's kind of what Factorio would be if everything had a shared inventory almost. It's pretty close, minus
That's
the biters.
basically what we're doing, right? There's a little bit difference. We have like the elements where you do have to transport resources to buildings, and therefore there's the bottlenecks that you're uncovering through that. But we do have a kind of a universal warehouse element, right?
Okay.
Where you can put things in storage. So we think that there's kind of a balance you can strike where you can still have the logistics. I mean, it depends on how you're defining it. Where the logistics of you have to get resources to the right building in order to get the right outcome, the right producing the right commodity, the next item. But at the same time, there isn't the same pressure of how do I get all the resources from one area to another, and mainly because you have a different constraint in our game, which is the limited amount of space.
For
And I
sure.
think so. If I can chime in for a sec, the thing that I am trying to keep an eye on as I sort of have some influence over it, it is
Absolutely.
I want there to always be something to design. And it may be that and I think it's important that it be something that you design and then let run for a bit, right? But I think that as long as there are constraints on what you can do, then you have the opportunity to create emergent gameplay that's fun. Because for me, at least, when it comes to Factorio, yes, logistics are an enormous amount of the struggle, but like it's often not the minute to minute struggle. I mean, yeah, I have to go through and, when you unlock bots, you have to set up your bot network and you have to mark these chests as being this kind of chest and whatever. And so there are moments like that, but there's a lot of fighting past me and what I thought was a good idea to do with belts, and those sorts of design challenges that come up, the naturally emerging ones, they come up because there are pressures, and those are spatial pressures. And I think as long as we give the player enough opportunity to say, look, here are some design pressures you have. You have this much space. You have this many resources. Maybe there's other criteria that we're thinking of right now. As long as there's something for them to, in a sense, optimize and have to make decisions about, and not have a clear answer, right? There has to not be, this is the one solution. I mean, to a certain extent, sometimes it can happen. Like, okay, fine. I've thought about how to make a smelter stack in Factorio like a billion times. I kind of have a go-to design at this point. I think that part's okay. But as long as it's not like there is one thing to do that's optimal, oh, and it may suck. Like if that ever happens, it's bad. If it's unfun to do, that's even worse. As long as we avoid those sorts of things, then I think there's still like a meat and potatoes to the game for people to sink their teeth into.
Absolutely.
And I'm kind of drawing from, this was some discussions we had about Pi, and you were the one that actually like brought this up to me. It's the Zen garden approach, and that is to say where you're playing the game and you're essentially tending that Zen garden. It's not like you have to, or biters are going to come eat you in this particular case, but there's still like a sense of you're making something. I don't want to say grow because we're digging, but you know what I mean? They're develop is a better word. So
Going
anyway, I'll
down.
hush. That's sort of what my thought is on that, and I'm curious what you have to say about, or what you think about it, Jack.
No, I think you're 100% right. And also, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're so early in development. We haven't made like strong decisions on all the designs. And Eric's going to kill me if I come out and be like, yeah, this is what the game is. But yes, I think how you framed it is 100% correct. The Zen garden approach is, I think, exactly the direction we're looking to head, where
Kind of
you
pruning
have these.
the
Well,
tree.
and it's also the element of like the creative design problem that you're solving for is something you can actively participate in or solve over time. You can be inefficient and then slowly become more efficient, or you can try and optimize that as soon as possible. And I think that's a really profound part of Factorio that I really enjoy, and something I think that we're really trying to capture. So it's a yeah, I think that's really on
Yeah.
point.
Another question I have for you regarding the factory element, because, as I mentioned, like, I think a big dividing point between the classic clicker genre and just exponential growth genre almost as a whole, number go up is the main part of why you like the game genre. And I do think Factorio fits that bill because it's number go up. You get more iron plates, and that's a big part of the satisfaction. And Galdoc and I talked about this a little bit on our logistics episode, but one big part of the reason that feels good in Factorio is the feedback, the visual feedback. When your belt has a couple iron plates on it, but now it's fully saturated, you're like, oh, yes, like a full iron plate belt. And it feels so good when you went from your 2 iron plates a second to 15 iron plates a second. So, what are the ways that you can and I imagine you've already thought about this, and if you haven't, well, I'm curious what your thoughts are, but like, what are the ways you can kind of emulate some of that feel good visual feedback in like a desktop idler situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why I reached out to Galdoc in the first place, was because I knew that I couldn't do it myself. But he is very capable. We also have another amazing artist, Julio. And I think we're coming up with a really special style to approaching it, that's clear and readable in the format that we're doing, and at the same time has some of that Factorio inspired heart of, the industrial punk, I think, is maybe what Derek said it was.
Diesel punk, but yes,
Diesel
same
punk,
idea.
diesel punk.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
okay.
Um, and then I think, but from a mechanics perspective, a gameplay perspective, I think having what you mentioned, which is items be visually represented as things that you are creating and moving to different parts of the map, to different machines, to different storages. That I think is critical for the player's mental model. I think
Hmm.
there's some questions about like cognitive load with any game, right? Like what does it mean to be teaching a player how to play a game? I think one of the most brilliant parts of Factorio is yes, the reward you get from seeing your factory producing so much more, having more things, and that exponential growth, but it also is really important for players' understanding of the game. Games live in your head as much as they live in the application, and the application's job is to provide feedback of what's going on in the game that changes how you interact with it in your own mind. So, yeah, I don't know if that makes enough sense, but that's certainly
Yeah,
our approach.
I
I
love
just want to give
that.
a quick
So
shout out really quickly, if I could, to Julio, because that art is amazing, and like it makes my life so much easier to have these wonderful things. Julio does a lot of concept art, and if you've seen my streams, you'll watch me just put that on the screen and just let it sit there while I try to design and essentially replicate it. But mad
yes,
shout out
and I
to
need
Julio.
to. I mean, I guess we haven't told the podcast listeners. So go check out Galdoc's streams. He's actually streaming some of his development on this game, so you can go and kind of see some of the pieces that we're talking about here. So definitely go check that out.
Also, for any Sirocco fans in the chat, because I know I saw some earlier, Julio designed half of the ships and a lot of other parts of that game. So, yeah, we owe him so much. He's truly an incredible artist. So
Amazing.
happy to be working with him again.
Amazing. So with the items, and warehouses and moving and art and all this stuff, my brain keeps coming back to this idea of like, what, how do you, because it's on your desktop and it's an idler game, not just a factory game like Satisfactory or whatever. Where do you, and obviously this is like you said, many decisions are not final, but how do you figure out how much time does the player need to sink in to a given moment to moment, like oh, I'm going to do a new build for this thing, I need more coal to feed my power plants, whatever it is that supposed to take 5 minutes to do? Is that supposed to take 30 minutes to do? Is
The
that supposed to take
ratio
1 minute? And then once you've set it up, how long does that take before it's kind of like, oh, I've collected enough of X? And these are I'm kind of getting to like balancing this is almost a question you answer at the end of development. But maybe just how do you even go about figuring that out? Because it feels like there's a lot of right answers.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And honestly, at some point, if you're interested in, we should really have a podcast with Eric. This is the type of this is
I
the
think
area
we
that
will.
he is really brilliant, and he's really the architect of Desktop Factory. So I'm probably not going to do, especially when it comes to tuning and things like that, do what he would talk about, do it justice. But what I would say broadly is that with game design, there are system balancing elements, and then there's tuning, right? And what I mean by that is that it kind of gets at what I think Goldak was talking about earlier, where there's certain times where you actually have a system in balance, where something is not optimal because it just isn't as good in the game as something else, right? Or you just never will have enough emergent, interesting decisions because it's in too much tension with another system. In Sirocco, we had that with some augmentations, right, which are kind of like talents in Dota, and we had all this ship switching. So there's always a tension between how do I invest in putting points in augmentations and then also to switch chips, right? So that's something you can't actually solve with tuning. You can create another, band-aid solution, right? For us, it was resetting those augmentations, which worked out well, right? But there was no matter of, oh, if we just make, a number, a variable go up or down, that's going to solve that problem. Versus when there are times in game design and game development where you can say, oh, we have the systems in place, they're functioning, we just have to figure out the right variables for the player experience to function the way that is ideal, right? And I think that's a little bit where our current direction is, where it's like we want to make sure the core systems are great, and then we can tune the time of everything based off of where player feedback is coming from, right? Because there are elements that you really don't know until you have people who have never played your game try it.
Right.
And I think that's when it comes to pacing, that's something you really need feedback for. I think broadly, what we will do is we'll have kind of like, models and graphs of other games. Essentially, we'll say in Cookie Clicker, this is the rate of exponential growth. We could use that as a basis and have spreadsheets that calculate where different variables should be based off of that kind of growth graph. But we won't really know what the ideal pace is for our game, I think, until we get player feedback.
Totally. And this is very much like I said, like the type of thing that you think about towards the end. But part of me is kind of just wondering, like, is the idea that what is the question I'm getting at? I guess that's part of the same question we're going to get at later. So let's talk a little bit
If I
about
can,
Oh, please, Galdoc.
I
Yes,
was gonna say, like, it sounds like you're kind of asking about the ratio of active to passive playing time, and
a little bit.
what
Yeah,
is going to what elements sort of are going to shove or not shove, but like influence it and say there's more active stuff to do in in one hand or another. But yeah, I think that's going to come down to a lot of different pieces. You know, so
yeah.
I
And
mean,
there's a couple other games that come to mind. We can chat more in Discord even after the podcast because my brain is on fire with this topic. But there's a game called Civ Idle, a successor to Industry Idle. Which is kind of in the same ballpark of it's a little bit of an idler, but it's also kind of a factory game that has a lot of elements that are interesting. And one of them is you can get a lot done very quickly after you've prestiged a lot, but it's a lot of tedious clicking to build all the buildings again. Like you can rebuild a whole city very fast after you've prestiged a bunch, but like it takes like 2 hours of active play to get back to the point where you can then let it idle again. And so there's kind of this interesting, there's almost two variables in the active idle spectrum, because there's the spectrum of just what percentage of time are you active versus idle, but then there's the spectrum of when you're active, how long are you active. And like you said, those are tuning questions that you change towards the end. But I guess my kind of question is there an initial goal in where that lands, or is it almost just kind of with playtesting and getting people that also enjoy games like Rusty's Retirement and other desktop companion games, are we just kind of going for like what vibe feels right?
Yeah, I think there's a certain it's going to be a balance of both. I think what's cool about our game is that there's going to be ways to play it actively, and those ways of playing actively will lead to significantly faster results, probably more than other games because of how logistics function. Like the point being is that you can play our game, I think, more actively than Rusty Retirement, and because it's not just passive gains that you're getting, there's actually optimizations of like how you build your factory, that you probably could get exponentially better returns and progress much faster. That being said, there's going to be a certain amount of limits to probably how fast you can go, and yet at the same time, I think how we'll approach Prestige will be very different from other idle games, for instance.
Big word
Um,
dropped. Prestige.
yeah, or I mean, we haven't really gotten too deep into that topic, but I think where our heads at is that there probably will be a beginning and end that you want to, for us, we want to have a situation where you want to be playing over and over and over again, not just play it once and then be done. And I think one of the interesting ways of doing those types of what you gain after one run of these idle games, prestige mechanics, is a little bit different because you're choosing to start over to get a bonus, right? For us, maybe you would get the bonus on completion. Maybe there's a choosing earlier. It's hard to say. Maybe we'll get there. But I think what's really fascinating is if you have a mechanic where every time you're approaching the game in a new run, there's a different element that alters how you're actually approaching building your factory in our example, in our game, in our context. So like instead of just saying you get flat 20%, everything's faster, you get more resources. It's like maybe you get 20% of a specific resource, or maybe you get 100%. You're twice as fast. Your belts just move twice as fast, right? That's totally uh, game changing for how you could design things. You know, how you approach building and progressing in the game could be dramatically different. So I think that's what's really exciting to us is how do we have the game evolve in not just, you know, the different things you unlock, but how you play it. You know, that's always a
It's almost a little bit, I don't remember if Galdoc, you and I talked about this with Space Age, but going to a new planet is almost like prestiging a little bit because the devs' intention was that you could, and it could even be very fun to show up on a planet with very little to start with, and it's almost like you're starting a fresh factory. Of course, you can bring as much as you want in your space platform, but if you don't go with everything all ready to go, it can actually be kind of fun to like build up almost from scratch on a new planet. And that certainly was that their intention, that you could do that if you wanted to. And that is basically what you're saying, where it's kind of like a prestige, but with the baseline structure and mechanics changed. How you get iron plates is now different. How the first building you need to build is actually a different one this time.
Yep.
There's a question that comes to my mind, though, which is discomfort. There's some discomfort in that because now you're giving, rather than prestiging and getting to do your familiar territory, but better, which is the whole feeling of progression that you talked about with battleships and Dota, where you're like, I want to get more powerful. And prestiging is like, I'm now more powerful. It's almost like a little bit of a sidestep where it's like, well, I'm more powerful, but things are different. So it doesn't really feel like like I can't compare this more powerful apple to my previous orange.
Well, I would say
Yeah.
that there's a sorry, Galak, you
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'll just say quickly. Factorio uses a lot of negative constraints, right? In the sense of when you go to, you know, a new planet, there's all these new problems you're having to solve for. You can't build the same way you do on Novice, right? The first planet, right? Um, and you know, I think with an idle game, you have to invert that, right? There has to be positive incentives to be doing things in a different way versus negative ones, because the negative ones will feel like you're taking a step backward. Versus when you create a positive one, you could approach everything the same way, but now
Right.
you've gained some amount of additional power that if you're interested in, you could then gain additional benefits from, right? You'll have more synergies in ways that you didn't have before. I think that's how I would frame it and think about it.
I love that.
Yeah, the a fun little story is during the playtesting of Space Age. Um, so I was basically trying. Like, I found a couple of bugs, but there was one thing that I did, which was I went to Vulcanus with nothing, and I didn't have to. I didn't realize that I was smooth of brain, and so I go there and I show up on the planet. I'm
Max
like, all right, I'm
understanding.
here, and I'm literally going from zero, so to speak, to factory. And at some point, I like mentioned this to Code Green. He's like, why didn't you take anything with you? I was like, shut up. But it was fun. It was interesting. But for me, it was like I actually enjoyed that. I enjoy starting from nothing and going to something. And you know what? Actually, Code Green would later go on to make Any Planet Start, where you can start on any planet and get that sort of feeling from starting from zero. Like as something to think about. So you actually suggested this to me. Krydax, which was Planet Crafter. We did that one episode where we started talking about the other games that we had played in this sort of factory space, and Planet Crafter was one of the ones that came up. And so I did. My son actually really enjoys it. And there is a mechanic where you can go to other planets, and it's interesting because you can only take so much with you. It's the classic, okay, here's a rocket, you get into rocket, you throw everything you can in your backpack, you've got like this little bit of inventory that the rocket gives you, and then when you land, good luck. And they try to make it as gentle as possible. They're like, there's a checklist here, and that involves a rocket to go back should you really want to, and you may want to, so just do that thing, player. I mean, and I suppose you could ignore it, but it turns out you don't necessarily have to, and you do kind of get that feeling of starting from scratch again. But it's almost exactly like prestiging in as much as, okay, but now you have access already to the big, tools that you would use to terraform the planet. Just for those of you who haven't played it, Planet Crafter is a thing where you're sent to a planet. It's barren. There's no atmosphere or whatever, and you do stuff. You gather resources. You build machines, and you terraform the planet. Doesn't make any physics sense, but whatever. It's fun. And it's kind of like an idler. You
Mhm.
only go forward. You gather you put oxygen in the atmosphere, you heat up the planet so that it's livable, etc. And it never goes backwards. So in that sense, it's kind of like what you were talking about. It's all positive stuff. You only go in one direction, nothing coming to eat you. You just have to, it's a matter of, are you being efficient in a sense? Are you terraforming the planet quickly enough? Are you spending your time wisely? And that leads itself to its own interesting questions. But I do kind of like how they did the quote unquote, as you say, prestiging. It's because I'm not sure if it is exactly applicable in this case, but you go to another planet, you use the stuff, and it does feel good. So I think there is a path forward with it. So yeah, I don't know, just pointing that out as an interesting example.
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, even just the idea of prestiging in idle games, I feel like I have a podcast worth of thoughts on because I played so many idle games. But specifically, the idea of like different bonuses, like you were saying, Jack, with like, oh, maybe, just one resource is doubled in rate or whatever. And what I love about that is that can create some emergent optimizations of like, ooh, before there was like, I could just do coal to power, but there was this other route, like I could do coal to like 2 resources, and then this one is used for this other process, and then this other one like sort of makes power, but it's not really worth it, but like I might as well do it. But then now that I'm getting twice as much coal for the same input, whatever, buildings or time or power, now all of a sudden that tertiary thing could be the better way to do it. And then you get into the reverse question of like, wait, this thing that previously was the main product is now the byproduct. And I'm
Exactly.
just making crap up, but like that happens
No,
in
that's
Pyanodons too. And that's kind of a really cool way to think about prestiging changing the game, is all I wanted to throw in there.
yeah, 100%. I mean, like to me, even having choices between different prestige bonuses, that would be sick. Like, so right now, for instance, we have a smelter and we have miners, right? And the smelter optimally takes on 2 different miners, right? So you want to have 2 miners for each smelter to get optimal, refining. Um, but then what if you have a prestige that says 100, plus production on miners? Then suddenly you could do 1-to-1, and
Mm-hmm.
because space constraint is so important for us, it means you could have a completely different layout design for your whole factory. So we're still very early in the development cycle, so I don't want to get too ahead of myself. But that's definitely the area that we're most interested in.
Totally.
Then suddenly, every time you're playing, you're unlocking new things that allow you to play the game differently. I think that's the stuff that's most exciting to us.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, then you get into Satisfactory kind of accomplishes this. I mean, not prestiging, but this idea of like changing the game on you with the alternative recipes, and you get the hard drives and you're choosing between 3 options. And some of them do significantly change. Like, oh, now I can just skip screws entirely, and not have screws in my base. And like that
That iron
completely
pipe
changes
recipe.
your layouts.
That iron pipe
Yeah.
recipe, though, that's a huge one too.
Yeah. So there's so much cool stuff there. I'm sure we could talk about all day, but there's a couple other kind of dev questions I wanted to kind of throw into the pot here. One of them is a little bit more of like a meta game development question. We've been getting into the weeds with like more the literals about Factorio stuff or factory stuff. But when you're developing a game, your hope is that you can make some money at some point, and there are different ways to make money off of games. So microtransactions is a pretty common one these days, and I know we had kind of thrown it in the show notes here as a thing to potentially discuss. I'm curious what some of your thoughts are. Opinions on microtransactions are pretty strong among different communities. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dive in. I mean, first off, a desktop factory is not going to have microtransactions. Um,
Yay.
it's gonna be a box game with DLC, down the road probably, or something like that, if it's popular. Um, but I think, you know, from the perspective of the gamer, I think it's pretty easy to track the introduction of microtransactions and the shitification of games,
Hmm.
if you want to use that word. Um, and the studio that produced Arkham Asylum stopped making Batman games and instead made Suicide Squad, right? So it was a trend. Microtransactions, as they've been introduced into gaming, have led to, I think, the industry getting worse, and I think that's really important to acknowledge. Um, at the same time, I think a lot of the anti microtransaction takes are a bit too reductive. Now, I'll let you guys have your own opinions too. We can talk about them, but I think it's interesting to me that two of the most beloved games on Steam right now are free to play, right? And really, when we're talking about microtransactions, maybe we're talking about Premium Plus, where it's a game that you buy. Then you have microtransactions. I think that always kind of feels a little worse to people. But Dota 2 and Counter Strike are beloved games, and I don't think the player bases have problems with how Valve is monetizing that game. And it's even hilarious to me in retrospect. Like, one of the best gaming documentaries, I don't know if you've seen it, it's called Free to Play. It's a Dota 2 documentary about the international, and it's called Free to Play. So microtransactions didn't always have the kind of baggage that they have now. And also Dota created the first battle pass with the compendium, and everyone loved it. The difference is that it was just really good, and the whole point of it made a lot more sense. I think what happened in the industry was mainly about optimizing revenue, and with that came a lot of worse content from the games themselves. But I think it's really important to kind of back up and say, like, well, what are the business models of games, right? You have the box price, right? That's the buy to play, right? That's when you purchase Elden Ring, and then you
It's what
have
we
all
all
the
grew up
content.
with.
Yes,
You actually bought a
exactly.
game at a store.
Or
Weird.
Yes,
even
100%.
shareware, where you would play like the first episode and then you'd have to buy the other two, or
100%. Yeah,
Commander Keen.
yeah. You
And we
have the
still have those.
demo
Yeah,
box price.
demos are still a
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are super important. And then you have the Premium Plus, right? I think that's the worst case scenario is probably like the Star Wars Battlefront game or whatever. And then the best one would be like World of Warcraft, right? That game was insanely expensive when it came out, and it was box price plus a subscription. And then obviously they have microtransactions that came later. Um, and then there's the free to
What
play
was the
model, right?
Battlefront? I'm not familiar with the Battlefront one you're talking about.
I think it was Battlefront from like, I don't know, like 2017 or something. You had to buy each Jedi. People hated it
Ugh.
because, yeah, like the best Jedi, and everyone wanted to play Jedi, right? But you had to like purchase each one. It might even been like loot boxes within. It was not good.
Yikes.
Essentially, it was very pay to win, and I think we can all agree pay to win is the worst, right? Particularly in a
Yeah.
competitive game, no one likes pay to win. But to kind of go back to the incentives, I think what people don't recognize enough is that there are two different incentives between game developers and gamers, right? A game developer comes out with a game. They want as many people to play their game as possible, assuming that they're trying to make a good game, right? They want people to enjoy their game so that they know that it's good and they want to keep playing it and purchase it in one way or another, right? Now, the gamer is in a different place with their incentive where they don't want to buy a bad game, right? You don't want to purchase something that sucks. So the reason why demos exist is to give you a taste of something so that you understand what it is before you buy a box price game. But the free to play model is actually one that's super interesting when it comes to any game that needs to be continually updated or has continual costs like servers, right? And the reason why it's so fascinating is because what it's saying is that we can have a certain group of players that are willing to spend lots of money on a game, subsidize a group of players that maybe can't spend money on the game, right? Maybe they can't afford it, or they, never would have the interest in purchasing a game first. Maybe they would spend money eventually, but then wouldn't have that incentive to do it in the first place, right? So in a certain way, I think it's a pretty profound business model in that way that you can't really get if it's just a box price. The problem is that there's a lot of negative incentives for companies after that fact, right? Or also just requires a tremendous amount of players for it to be profitable for game studios, which is another big issue. That being said, I think what's more important for me to talk about really quickly is that there's actually a lot of problems that come with the box price model. And I think the first one is what we saw in the 2000s a lot, which is this idea of, hey, we can come out with we can develop a shitty game, like whatever. We can develop a game that maybe is good, maybe it's bad. We'll just give a bunch of money. If I'm a publisher, I give a bunch of money to a studio, and they come out with a game, and all I need to do is spend a certain amount of money on marketing, have a cool trailer, have it in GameStop in the front area, and then I'm going to sell X amount of copies, right? That's what they would do. They would say, we would get this amount of conversions. And then whether the game is good or not, if anyone was playing through the game, didn't actually matter because they were just buying the box price, right? So a lot of people were buying crappy games and then trading them into GameStop, 2 weeks, 1 week later, maybe a couple days later. And I don't think that's actually talked about enough because it's not a good approach to game development. I think fortunately with Steam, that's become less the case. But there are some kind of dark incentives underneath the box price as well that we don't always acknowledge. And then the other piece that's really interesting is what you see in Tarkov, right? Escape from Tarkov, where they had a box price game, but then they realized, hey, we're a live service product and we need to keep monetizing our game in order to have revenue grow the studio and then also just maintain things, right? So then they had all these more and more expensive boxes that they were selling to players, and it never really felt good. It felt very predatory for the players that existed. So, I don't really know the answer to that question. I I think microtransactions have a place as long as it's not pay to win in a lot of games. I prefer that over, having a $500 box price every 3 years or something like that. Um, but there's also maybe something that could be figured out with subscriptions. But I think people hate subscriptions too, right? Only WoW gets away with a subscription.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't really know the answer ultimately, but I'm interested in all of your thoughts.
Most of my thoughts are pretty. Um, it's one of those things where, as you said earlier, you kind of framed it in the way that I kind of tend to think about it, which is you have what is good for the gamer and what is good for the developer. And when those align, then cool things happen. And when they are misaligned, then you have kind of what you were talking about with like predatory things and various other negative sort of outcomes. And I think we can all agree that, yeah, definitely pay to win is just no go like that. I understand that companies want to, in a sense, get a good ROI, but I don't personally think that that's a very ethical way of getting there. Um, I also tend to think about the people who have very addictive personalities, and they will become what have been called the whales. They're the ones that will, in a sense, be the few that fund the development of something. But then you kind of wonder, did they really have that money? Or did they just spend something that was very important to them because they were addicted? Or is there's another consideration, which is, are you creating a sort of social environment where not having some is having the default skin, as just a simple example, sort of seen as a negative social thing? Like, I don't like that idea either. I think it's fine to have skins, but it's a fine line between that and all of a sudden, if you don't have a custom skin or something, then you are kind of looked down upon. And I
I don't
don't
know.
really
I
have a
love
social.
I love mogging all the black suits in Warzone with my base skin.
I
No,
only
I,
understood about
I
half the
understand what you're talking
words in
about.
that sentence, but it was great.
Transmogging, I think, is what you're talking about, where you change
uh,
the.
you just show like outshining them. You're like, oh, I'm the default skin. I'm owning you.
Yeah, yeah.
But like, I think that is if a studio is very careful about those sorts of things and handles the microtransactions in such a way as to kind of stay away from those, then I think there is a space for them, because I think that it is important for a studio to be profitable, and you do need to make money. It's just, can you keep intact ethics? And obviously, people are going to make decisions. I'm not about to say that, you know, you design this system, you try to make sure that people have it's sort of like above board, it's honest, it's straightforward, whatever, and yet still someone's going to become addicted. I'm not trying to say that we now all of a sudden have to adopt responsibility for the actions of those who might play the game. Like that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that as long as that's something that is sort of consciously held in the decisions, as content is developed and put out there, then you're probably on a better path. But I always, as a person who is only just beginning to, in the past few years, wear the hat of the developer, my initial thoughts were always kind of what you were talking about earlier. It's like, I can just buy a game. I've said this to my own kids. Like, you want to play this game over here that has microtransactions where you'd have to pay. But you could spend that time playing a game that you could just buy and own and not have to pay any microtransactions. And the amount of fun you would experience is the same. You would still feel good at the end of that. And whenever it comes to making those sorts of decisions, whether it be on a mobile game that chose to go with the let's pull the strings and try to make people feel like they have to buy, or they're getting left behind, or whatever it is, or whatever 2048 clone that has no ads, it's just a stupid little game that someone decided to make on their own time. And well, I know which one I would prefer to pick. And for me, it's like, I know I, to a certain extent, am in a situation where I have this sort of luxury, but I will choose to throw money at a developer who sort of follows those sorts of rules. But I also recognize the fact that I'm not representative of everybody. I mean, we'd all love to live up to that. But I mean, times are hard. People don't necessarily have the money to say, you know what, I want to. Rusty's Retirement has a. I just when I was while we were talking, I looked it up on Steam. It has like a support version, right? It's like you could pay like $3 or $4 extra or something, and they just say this is for support, and the only thing you're going to get is your little character is gold, and that's it. And you know what? I love that. That to me feels great. It's like when you bill the thing that you're buying as, if you want this, we will give it to you, but you are really just supporting the development of the game. To me, that feels in line with ethics. I feel in good ethics. Like it's like you are making it clear that you are the primary benefit of this exchange is that you are going to support the devs. And so I think there is always a place for it. It's just, it's a very tricky thing to get right. If that makes sense. So I'm not going to come out swinging and say all microtransactions are terrible, but just
Yeah, the flip side for me that I always think about is this: there's I have friends of mine that just they can't afford to buy games. That's the hard part. They only play free to play games. Brazil, for instance, a lot of countries, they only play free to play games. So, it's I very much agree with you, and then at the same time, it's hard because it's like it's somewhat of a privileged way of going about so yeah, it's tough. It's a tough dynamic, and I think that there's predatory ways of taking advantage of monetizing players, and then there's ways that you can do it that are, I think, fair. But yeah, it's not always easy.
Yeah,
And also from the business perspective. One thing I will say, you guys should, I mean, I know I'm just like plugging other people in our company.
Please
You should
do.
definitely talk to Max. He is really in tune with the gaming business side, and he's worked on, Twitch and Loaded, which are, obviously really important for marketing these days in gaming. So he would be another great guest to have these types of conversation because
it's so interesting. Because like you said, there were a couple things that both of you hit on that I just think are such interesting. Like, this is not a simple thing. One of them was, Jack, something you said about how the idea that whales subsidize free-to-play players or players who can't afford, to pay the full amount or whatever. Maybe the game's not completely free, but like some amount is subsidized by that. Or maybe like the game is actually really expensive and they need an average of $100 per player per year to maintain all the development and servers and stuff. And like maybe the game costs $20, but where's that other $80 coming from? The whales, And so that sort of environment. And that made me think of another thing that is universally loved and is essentially the same idea, which is the Humble Bundle. The idea of a Humble Bundle is all about raising support for charity, but on the actual effect of it, it's the same idea where it's like different people can pay different amounts kind of at will, and it doesn't really affect the product they're getting. And at least if we're talking about cosmetics for microtransactions, it's the same idea where like, you're involving the player's will for how much they want to spend in the matter and trusting that you'll still get an appreciable amount of money out the other end. Now, of course, Galdoc, you got into the like, are you guilting players into buying these skins? Are you making people feel bad for not having them? I mean, that's, I think I land a little bit on that's not the dev's responsibility. However, there is a difference between devs who are hiring researchers to be like, how can we make people feel FOMO? That is an unethical thing. And we know game developers have done that. And that's just unethical, period. And I don't think anyone's going to argue about that. Like, if you're literally hiring people to ask the question, how can we get people more addicted to our game so they spend more money? Like, that's clearly unethical. Like, you don't have a responsibility just in a general sense for other people's actions, but if you're specifically trying to get people to take unhealthy actions on purpose, I'd say that is now your responsibility. And that goes beyond the scope of, I think, what I mean when I say like whales subsidizing. If you've got a bunch of cosmetics that you're not trying to force people to feel bad about, the mere fact that they exist in your game and look cool, I don't think that's really your problem that other people feel a little bit of like, oh, I wish I had that cool skin. It's like, okay, well, you can buy it. Like, that's how a lot of things, and that's how real life skin clothes work. It's like like to some level that's just okay. I don't know, but again, that's
That's another
people,
interesting thing where the double
yeah,
standard is, because in
yeah,
physical, it's always interesting looking at why games are scrutinized in a different way from like sports, you know.
right,
Now I know that's because it's physical, but I don't know. Do we really think about that enough? I always wonder because I nowadays look at it far less, you know, especially that the games themselves have become completely digital. Like, why are we so okay spending so much money on sports in various different ways when it's different, you know, from games? Sometimes it's much more difficult, but that's a whole broader topic.
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't mean to
I guess
interrupt you.
I'm somewhat separated from the whole sports aspect, so I don't watch sports. I'm not that person, but yeah, I mean, to touch on your point, I was specifically referring to the thing where it's like when someone buys a cosmetic, it like does this thing where it announces to everybody, hey, he got this thing, and does like the sparkle and the sound effect and whatever, and makes you it does create that FOMO effect. Or where you have like this was something that World of Warcraft did, where you would only have access to something for a limited amount of time, even though it's a digital thing that you really
Hmm.
could have infinite copies of, so to speak. But they wanted it to they introduced artificial scarcity.
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
are the sorts of practices that I was talking about, and that's why I sort of separated out the idea that yeah, you can't, like, if you put skins out there and you just sell them and they're always available and you're not doing these FOMO things, then if people buy them and they feel proud of it and the other people look and say they want them, that you can't control that. That's not
Yeah.
it's not really where I was kind of trying to go
Yeah,
with
The
it.
no,
two
I
things,
got you.
the two last things I just wanted to say is that they're actually, I think that the model that is most aligned with players' interests, I'll say, is, at least in my opinion, is the marketplace model, where if you have a large enough game, and it requires a really large game, you know, I think the other question we need to talk about is like the actual business of games is much harder than people often think when they're just playing games, right? But the marketplace model is really interesting if you have a situation where skins are really valuable to players and they're willing to trade between themselves. If you take fees off of that, the incentive for you as a game developer is really great, because then it's suddenly like all I have to do is make sure my game is great and I come out with skins that people like. And the fact that people are trading them is just a signal that, you know, we're doing good as developers, right? Counter Strike's an example of that. Now, it does get ridiculous, and you could say that people are purchasing things that are irresponsible. But I think I have to kind of agree with Krydax, where it's like people can do that with anything now. Like sports betting right now is out of control, and no one's talking about prediction markets. Like
But
there's,
there are laws on that though.
I mean, prediction markets, poly market stuff. Nowadays, it's less regulated than ever, at least in the U.S. Um, and the point being is like I think, you know, when it comes to, I don't think trading in a marketplace is like gambling, for instance. And for I think a developer to be able to take fees from something like that, where, you know, players feel like they're interested in, you know, for Team Fortress hats or you know, Dota 2 skins or something like that. I think that's very interesting for aligning the player interest with the developer.
Yeah, it's there's so many. Yeah, and I mean, we'll probably have to move on, but like this is such an
At least for
interesting
live
topic.
service games, I would say, right? If you're
Right,
a
right.
single player game or even a multiplayer game that is single player, and it makes sense to have a box price, I don't think it's an ideal thing to have that stuff. But
Yeah,
there's
no,
a type of
I
game I
agree
think
that,
ought to
and
do
that
it.
model in a lot of ways is similar to kind of just the idea of selling skins. It's just you're taking the fees from a different place. But overall, I just think it's so interesting because you do get into that question of why is the developer making the game? Are they making a game to make a good game and reach more players? Are they making a good game and making money? Are they just in it to make money? And where are the, the knobs and sliders on all those questions? And usually as a player, at least as a slightly more I will say enfranchised video game player that play a lot of games over the years, etc., you kind of can tell, right? Like when you play a game, you can tell how greedy the developer is and you can feel it. But I think the problem and the people who get screwed over are the people who can't tell. The people who are, when these predatory companies are doing these predatory things, it's the people who can't tell that are the ones that get taken the most advantage of. And that is its own issue. But like when you're an actual game dev whose goal is not to be predatory, then you're never going to fall into that ditch. So all of these questions of like skins versus this versus that, like they're all reasonable at some level. It's just a question of like, how do we actually make it feel good for the players when they do spend money, whatever that means, whether it's a box or a microtransaction? And how does the dev actually make enough money to do the things they need to do, which might actually involve profit too. Like it's not bad to want to profit off of your game either. It's not just to pay the running costs of the server. It's like, what if I actually want to make a good amount of money as a dev who's talented? I think that's okay. But again, it just comes down to
enough
like
to pay the rent. The margins in games is a lot worse than people think. It's a lot harder
Right.
to make enough money to have a studio. I mean, like our game right now, we're doing for free, right? Like this is a passion project. People have to work other jobs, so it's not so much. I think gamers sometimes, because there are the big studios are trying to make millions of dollars, or you hear about these games that make hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a little bit of a survivorship bias of understanding how game dev works, where when you get into the nitty gritty and you're like, wow, I have to spend $10,000 a month to keep the servers running. It's a lot more difficult for an indie dev to make that happen. Not to say that there's not ways you can do for cheaper, and you should, but it's just the practical business element where you're like, how much can I make to support myself, and if I have a family, those questions they make it difficult. I think sometimes when you have to approach it from sustaining yourself, right? Because ideally, for at least for us, right, we want to make great games, right, and we want to be able to continue making great games. So really, it's not about getting rich. It's just the fact of like, at a certain point, you can't just grind with side work.
Exactly.
You have to make enough money to make it your full game. Otherwise, you're not going to be making great games. That's the problem.
I think there is a narrow path forward there. Like I understand that, I constantly am thinking of the games that have succeeded and the studios that produce those, like the Terrarias and the Factorios. And I think you actually said it best. It's like, well, being one of the most successful indie games of all time definitely is a business model. And everyone kind of wants to be that thing.
Yeah,
And
it's
it does
great.
grant a great deal of freedoms. Like, when it comes to Terraria, they have just made update after update after update. And that game still, was it like $10? It hasn't, like, and it goes on sale, like it's half off a lot of times. But, and then you have like Factorio, where you have a game where you essentially try to lure in, to some extent, people who would be willing to make content for you, and in droves. And so now all of a sudden, they did make an expansion. But I mean, let's be honest, they almost didn't have to. We had content just continually coming out, and it's still continuing to come out,
Yeah.
made entirely by the community. So, yes, there are these paths forward when you try to keep your eyes on the target, but you also do have to there is an element recognize that there is an element of, I don't say luck. It's it's a confluence of several things. Luck is one of those things.
Absolutely.
Passion, a good product. All of those things are also part of it, and without those, it also does not work.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, 100%.
So
I think if you do make a great game, you can have that success. I think that's
yeah.
important to believe in.
You can,
and I know,
but it's not guaranteed, and that's the hard part. I think of the restaurant industry, making a game is like trying to start a restaurant, and you look at the restaurant industry, and most restaurants fail. It's like most of
that's
them do,
brutal.
and it's not because they suck. I'm sure some of them do, but a lot of great restaurants fail. and there's no price point they could set for their food. There's no model they could pick that would have made them succeed. And I think the same is
Yeah.
true for some games where it's like you can do microtransactions. It's not wrong. You can say, hey, we got to charge $80 a head for this game to be able to function at all and be profitable, and then people won't buy it and you fail. Or you could say, hey, we'll make it free, and then not enough players come in and buy microtransactions and you fail. And it's just like there's a lot of, I think it's almost more about finding a model that flows the best for your game, because at the end of the day, you need the money that you need, again, presuming you're not being predatory and putting profit above
And
making
also
a good game.
the other thing that's, I mean, what you just said is speaks to my heart. It's so real. You can feels like you can do so many things right and it still can fail.
still
I
fail.
mean, one of the hardest part even with Sirocco that we faced is like there were content creators who loved our game but couldn't stream it because there weren't enough players playing our game and there weren't enough people watching. People aren't interested in games that aren't viral successes. And there's a lot of negativity bias in terms of marketing. It was interesting, like when we had to switch off our servers to go to P2P for Sirocco, we had a game. What was it? GameSpot. I think GameSpot covered us. They didn't cover us when we were going to early access, even though we reached out. But they covered us when we had an issue with our game, right? When we had to switch over to P2P, but they thought we were closing our servers completely and not allowing players to play, right? So they saw a Reddit post, and the Reddit post was blowing up. So then they write an article, and it's like failure porn essentially, where people do like getting the reaction of watching things fail, and it's kind of sad because it's like, man, there's so many great games that you kind of need to have traction to keep gaining traction. And the Terrarias and the Factorias, they are constantly succeeding on their success, right? It's where the winners keep winning. That's where the algorithm on Steam is really great. That's where the algorithm on YouTube is built for those types of products that once they have a certain critical mass of popularity, then you have creators who can monetize that popularity themselves, and it's just a virtuous cycle, which is, I think, fantastic. It's easy to get too narrow in seeing that as the only thing that's happening. And there's a lot of great game developers that are just barely getting by or not getting by and having to stop. Slay the Spire, for instance, almost wasn't successful, right? Thank God someone, they had Keymail or sent out a bunch of keys. But for a long time during their playtest, they had like no users. So it's interesting
That's
to
crazy.
think of where games could have been if it wasn't just for some person who brought attention to enough people.
Not to quote Captain Picard, but I'm going to quote Captain Picard talking to Data in this moment. Data had failed in some way and was like having his own little, I don't want to say midlife crisis, his own existential crisis. He's trying to figure out what the problem was. And he says, it's possible to commit no mistakes and yet still fail. That's not a bug, that's life.
Yeah.
And that is the unfortunate truth when it comes to a lot of the indie games out there. And I think, at least from my perspective, like my goal is and has always been, and probably likely will be, is to essentially cultivate an environment in which I can create stuff that the world wants and that I'm good at, that I'm passionate about making, and that is sustainable. And the Japanese word for this, I believe, and I'm going to say this wrong, is ikorugi. And it's basically the conflict. It's the center of the Venn diagram of what you're good at, what you're passionate about doing, what the world needs or wants, and what is financially and whatever other aspect sustainable. And if you find the middle there, that's your purpose, so to speak. And that's essentially what I seek right now. That's why I'm working with Jack, because when you approached me a while back, I was like, first I'm going back and forth, and I asked a bunch of questions, and I kind of feel like we're on the same page on that.
Absolutely.
And so for me, that's the sign that, okay, this is the thing to do. And I don't know.
Yeah,
Sorry,
that's the dream. I mean, it's such an important thing to remember. And yeah, I mean, that's what our whole team is really gunning for, 1,000%.
I love it.
And we have a lot of ambitious projects that we want to do. Galdoc has a lot of great ideas for games. I have a really passionate project that hopefully we can make someday. And I think anyone who's played Soraka would love that too. So it's a situation where, this is a smaller scope project for us that we think can help us be, a sustainable studio that makes games that we love, and hopefully we can keep doing that.
Yeah, that's so cool. And yeah, Galdoc, with that confluence of those kind of that Venn diagram of those four things, I think that even in a grander scale, you're talking about like in your world, and I even think about, what we talked about last week with Factorio, or the last 2 weeks really, or last two podcasts with the Factorio and Pyanodons in specific. Like, how do you even enjoy playing it, and how do you be the player you want to be in Factorio? Because like, maybe I'm building this way, but I want to build organically, but how do I actually do that? And it's all about, finding that confluence of like, well, what are you actually good at? Like, because what do you actually want to do? What does the world want or need you to do? What can actually make money? And obviously those questions are slightly different questions if you're asking how to play Factorio, because you're not trying to make money, but you're trying to make fun. Like, fun is your money, right? Like, you're trying to produce entertainment out of your gaming time. And so it's always these mixtures of things. And I love that we're able to talk about this on this podcast. I think this is a really cool forum for this. And Galdoc, I'm so thankful for you to be here. And like, Jack, you've been so insightful. I'm excited to talk more with you on Discord after after this, because I have a lot of questions for you still. And we probably need to start wrapping up the podcast here because we're going a little long, but I do want to get into one more small question. I don't know if we can talk forever on this one, but the idea of design friction is a big one in game dev. And like, how do you know when there's too many features in a game versus too few? Because with a desktop idler, you've got the full gamut of possibilities. You've got everything from Ropuka, which basically sits there and cuts grass and you click upgrades once in a while, to, games that have an insane amount of complexity. So how do you know when enough is too much, and where's the friction there?
Yeah, it's always an interesting question. I would say broadly friction that leads to more interesting decisions, more engaging choices, and um, more engaging execution of those choices is really valuable, right? Like high friction games like Elden Ring is a good example that's creates a really great experience from that friction. Um, I think the friction that's tedious is the friction that everyone hates, right? And it's just not. Uh, it's not always apparent when you're developing a game if sometimes you're getting into that area, but I think generally you can find those designs that are creating unneeded friction. A lot of times we call them like non-decisions,
Mm.
this idea that you are kind of presented a choice, but in reality, it's not really a choice. In Dota has a lot of these as well, where it's like, oh yeah, you can buy any item, but realistically, if you're an agility hero, if you're a carry, you aren't going to be buying intel items.
Right.
There's a lot of times in games where you are presented a certain choice that really doesn't make sense. So I think for us, when it comes to the friction that people are going to be playing in our game, is ideally, all challenge to some degree is a type of friction. Keeping that friction compelling and kind of aligned with where players are at with their understanding of your game, I think is the balance, is the key that you're trying to find. Where you know players, the friction you're providing players is kind of increasing along with their understanding and ability to play the game. Now, I think because our game's an idle game, there's a additional layer of we don't want to create friction that produces needs for people to engage with the game immediately,
Right.
or a lot of pressure or anxiety. I think you can solve for that though. I think if you keep the friction mainly about uh, how well you're doing something versus whether you can do something or not, that's the difference, right? So really, I think our goal is to kind of keep the logistics, the core game design about how can I do something better, You know, how can I do something in a new and interesting way? Or how do I have a new resource that I have to manage versus a situation where it's like, oh, suddenly everything's falling apart, you know?
Yeah,
The
I love
biters
it.
have come.
No biters. You could make a joke, April Fool's mode, where do you remember the ski free game from ancient times where you're just the skier going down
Yeah,
the
with
mountain and
the Yeti.
the snow monster comes and eats you
I
at
was
some
terrified of
point?
that game as a kid.
Yeah, you just have that thing come in and eat your factory.
Oh,
Um,
what I was thinking we could do is just have like buried in the rock strata, just like the skeleton of a biter, and we just don't explain it. It's just never like it's just there.
yeah,
You drill past it. You don't have to, like you can't mine it for resources or anything. It's just
Yeah, that'd be a good Easter egg. We gotta have that.
that's
all
awesome.
right.
Well, we're gonna wrap up the podcast here. I think Galdoc's got to get out of here. So Galdoc, thank you so much for hanging out.
Thank you so much for having. It's great to be here, Jack. It was absolutely fantastic to get to talk with you. Krydex, as always, it's a pleasure.
Always.
But yeah, I do
Yeah,
have
this
to
was a
kind of
total
scoot. Must
blast.
go get my youngest for a thing. So I'll peace out. Take care,
Adios,
everyone.
Galdoc.
See ya.
And yeah, Jack, one thing that's been so cool about kind of our Pollywood squares on Twitch broke when Galdoc left. I gotta move this. Just, talking about design from a perspective of someone that's passionate about it. It's so obvious that, excuse me, it's so obvious that you are passionate, and it's not just, I don't know, you're not just regurgitating, a bunch of like words that you've read on a page, but it's like this is actually what you spend time thinking about, and what you want to figure out. And I think the way that you've talked about things is so extensible to life and not just game development. And I think that's true about a lot of things. If you want to be good at game development, it's probably a lot of the same questions that you'd ask. You mentioned screenplays. If you want to be a good writer, if you want to be a good person, what if you want to be a good husband or father or friend or worker at some unrelated job? I think a lot of these questions do revolve around the same thing. So I find it really cool to hear from people that think deeply about these things, because it's, as much as we talked about game dev, it's not just about game dev.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree. I think one of the most interesting things about games as an art too is it's, you, you know, Galdic talked about playing God. You are. I mean, for me at least, so much of what this is gonna get real philosophical for a second, but what makes humans human is freedom, right? Making choices, or maybe you believe it's the illusion of freedom. But I always think of games as, kind of micro universes where you're given these really distilled and rich choices for you to make, right? And you, Frank Lantz, who's the creator of Paperclips, I interviewed him when I was in college, and he says games um, make thoughts visible, right? He almost defines games as part of that decision-making process is making games visible, making your thoughts visible. And I thought that was such a beautiful description, because if I think about what games have been meaningful in my life, not just ones that I think are fun, maybe fun is great and stuff like that, but, games have really made me think of my life differently, and like taught me a lot of invaluable lessons. Like I think StarCraft probably taught me how to take tests more than school did, and so it's one of those parts of what I think you're getting at, where how we approach these kind of rich choices that you're given in good games, at least, teaches you a lot about yourself and how you approach life. And I've only understood the need to be more strategic through game development, and I think strategy is really important with every layer of life.
That's cool. Yeah, I feel the same. I've learned so much about life just from like Magic the Gathering, and like I think one of the biggest ones, I'm a math guy. I majored in math. And one of the biggest things that we as humans are really bad at is probability and like bias towards or against, and like, oh, I get mana screwed every time or whatever. And it's like, do you actually? Have you run the numbers? Like, are you actually unlucky? Because you're probably not, like chances are 90% that you're not in the bottom 10%. It's just how the numbers work. So it's just really cool to kind of hear from you. And I'm excited to hear more about your game in specific. It sounds like you guys are making something really cool, and you're making it from a place that is a very well-grounded place. And regardless of what your success ends up being in the market sense, I'm really excited about what you guys are making.
Yeah, I'm hyped for you to play it. I think it'll be awesome.
Yeah, really cool. Thanks so much for being here, Jack of Boxes. Do you have
Thank you for having
any
me.
final kind of thoughts before we close out?
The only thing I would say is that thank you to all the Srocco folks who showed up. We will be making a Discord for this project at some point, and I'll make an announcement there. And yeah, I appreciate everyone who's following the development on Galdoc stream. And when we do have a Steam page, I'm going to make sure everyone goes on wish lists. So those are the last things I'll say.
Perfect. And we will definitely update everyone here at the podcast about that, because we love factory games. And I think a lot of us love idler games too. I know in my Discord, people hit me up sometimes with the ones they're playing. So I think it's going to be a really good confluence for our listeners. So we'll definitely keep people in the loop. And with that, we'll wrap up episode 50 of The Factory Must Grow. Usually it's the first and third Monday that we stream the podcast. And who knows, maybe we can get some more devs for this game on the podcast in the future, which would be really fun. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. As always, if you have any questions, ideas for topics or guests, head over to the Krydania Discord and let me know there. I'll put links in the description to all of the relevant things. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Always remember, the factory must grow.
Thanks, everyone.